Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back now to Chris and Stress, a quick reading. Now, I should explain that even though we are starting to wind down on quite a lot of articles related to Chris, it doesn't mean we are not necessarily going to stop talking about him, but rather there's like a different sort of formality to the way I want to do things. And one of those formalities is sort of going through things from a even more... Because somebody left a comment, it was actually a very nice comment, that he was very, said I spoke about people with a great degree of respect, and I spoke in a very... Well, I think I might just... Actually, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll do the next best thing. Let me just do the right thing. Let me see if I can... I'll just pull up the comment, just for those who are curious. You should have more subscribers, dude. I love your channel. You talk about lolcows with such eloquence and an air of intelligence that I don't get from a lot of other channels. It could be the fact that you have a British accent and so automatically sound smarter. I dispute that. There are a lot of people who have British accents, but I think you do a good job. You also give good life lessons and advice concerning financing and how to act around people on the internet. You are the lolcow Jordan Peterson. Now, yes, I do know who Jordan Peterson is, and that's quite a statement if you ask me. But while there's going to be a lot of discussion about how things are going to be handled in the future, absolutely. One thing that I also have to emphasize, because this is actually going to play a role into this article, is that on average, I'm roughly out of the house for roughly 12 hours a day. Either I go to the gym at the crack of dawn, or I set out to go to work, or sometimes I will leave work early to go to the library in town, spend about 90 minutes there doing things like writing up scripts or trying to come up with ideas for like other video ideas and, business plans and stuff like that before I actually head off to work, because usually I don't start work until 12 o'clock in the day. So it is a little bit overwhelming sometimes, the fact that my days are so incredibly packed. Sometimes they're quite demanding physically, or maybe sometimes from a mental point of view they're quite draining, and they demand a lot for not an overwhelming level of like return. However, it's the thought, the consideration, and every just once so often is that people actually do legitimately thank me for the work that I do. So, and again, there are ways to channel stress, ladies and gentlemen, and as we will discuss a lot with this article, is that if there is one thing that is occurring with Chris, is that whenever he uses stress, either as an excuse or as legitimate backlog to suggest why Chris can't be bothered to do anything, from either applying for a job or trying to make his current situation a little bit more bearable, we're about to see that if these things are legitimately too tough for Chris, it's any wonder that perhaps maybe Greene County didn't get involved sooner regarding the hoarding situation at 14 Branch Lane Court, or whether or not social services should have been contacted on the grounds of, let's say, a safeguarding approach. Now, with that being said, because I don't live in the state of Virginia, the level towards things like that sort of thing, and whether or not it's paid through Social Security or, well, mostly through government tax, but it's a very different world. Well, at least when Chris was sort of like going off into college, for example, during the early 2000s. But then again, even in recent times, the only times that the law has actually thoroughly stepped in is when Chris has done things absolutely regarding breaking the law. But then again, ladies and gentlemen, you don't necessarily need to break the law for people to notice the fact that you do things that are genuinely unlawful, even though you're not breaking any laws. This will all play a role down the road, so let's get started. Chris and stress. Stress hinders the emotions and physical abilities as swiftly as a bullet. Yes, Chris somehow equates the idea of stress with being shot. Second, I really feel like I should be reeled into my Pokeball and stored in the PC for a while. This is Chris after finding out that Roastu had a pickle all this time. realistically, you can interpret this as saying that that's enough internet for one day. Stress is the bane of Christian Weston Chandler's existence. After high school, Chris soon learned he couldn't blame his shortcomings on his high-functioning and again, I mentioned this, I tried to allude to this before when we were discussing Chris and his attitudes towards work, is that despite the fact that Chris claims to have high-functioning autism, is that, well, same again, ladies and gentlemen, it's that autism is one of those things where it's judged on a very, very case-by-case basis. It's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. So there would have been absolute cases for people who might have autism or have Asperger's, and you know what, but if they show enough initiative and if they show enough desire and want and passion and enthusiasm in life in order to get the things that they want, then they'll do it in many cases. In fact, again, I don't really want to gloat my own ego or strut my stuff in front of you guys, but, well, it has to be said, I run my own business because I wanted to do something for the betterment of the rest of for what I wanted to do. I wanted to write scripts for all sorts of fictional works. I wanted to leave my mark on the world, and you know what? I decided to get up and do something about it. I mean, I could go over the entire story of how all of this came to be anyway, but I even once had a video call with Ridley Scott only 2 years ago, but that's a different story. Is that while all this is well and good in some cases, it's nowhere near the same for other people who are not necessarily less ambitious, but less guided, I suppose, or less who have. It's a difficult thing, and it's something that we probably need an entire video in itself to uncover or discuss in greater detail. Thus, he began to use stress as an excuse. However, it's assumed that Chris is probably confusing stress with depression or anxiety, refusing to admit that he is, in fact, unhappy with his current situation. Well, you know what? There are many people all over the world, ladies and gentlemen, who are unhappy with their current situations. There are people living in the most abstract and the most horrific sides towards poverty. And I imagine if you go to, I don't quite remember what the name of it is, but it's there's a country in Central Africa, it's dubbed as the single unhappiest country in the world. I like to imagine, again, and some things that go on there, you know what, I'd imagine that would leave you feeling pretty down and depressed. Or you could say, because that is all the life they know, how would they know any different? I know it sounds bizarre to say, but it's one of these sorts of things as well, especially when we're talking about Chris, is that if Chris is unhappy in his situation, then, well, first question, why doesn't he do anything about it? Now, immediately some of you may be asking to yourselves that, well, maybe Chris is not necessarily telling us the truth of the fact that he's unhappy. I mean, Chris has all the leisure in the world, he gets paid for doing nothing, he has a room full of toys, video games that he claims he plays regularly. He enjoys frequent daily excursions to McDonald's and Burger King. And you may be asking yourself, there's quite a lot to be actually quite envious of Chris there. In fact, but the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's not actually necessarily fulfilling. And well, listen, I've been unemployed myself. Let me tell you something now, ladies and gentlemen, it did not suit me one bit. Because, and again, it may be very similar for you guys, but I found the idea of being idle extraordinarily unnatural. It's very unnatural to do nothing with your day. And that's kind of maybe what Chris's problem is when he regards stress, is that I think he's under the impression that there was something greater for him in life, and all of a sudden, before he even knew what was happening, he's spending all of his time at home and literally isn't doing anything of necessarily great relevance. That's the sort of... Now, you may argue, for one instance, that perhaps the only real decent level of release or escape that Chris had at a young age was not only his excursions to the game place, but also writing Sonichu. But for other reasons we will get into, ladies and gentlemen, if Chris valued these sorts of experiences, these things that much, more in the case of the game place, then Chris would have probably have known better to have recognized the shortcomings of his behaviors. So you can't blame that. You can't blame the things that Chris does in public on stress. So let's keep going. Refusing to admit to the fact that he is unhappy with his current situation. Given the intensely sheltered lifestyle his parents provided for him well into his 20s, it is highly unlikely Chris ever experienced any form of intense anxiety or pressure that would give him severe psychological and physical effects. Apart from his consistent paranoia over getting trolled, and in recent years the financial crisis, he is, however, prescribed medicine for this stress. Since Chris tends to exaggerate anything that makes him feel remotely uncomfortable is classified to him as a stressor. Now, again, it's even in situations like these, ladies and gentlemen, where a lot of sympathy for Chris is sort of lenient towards one of two things. The first is the fact that whether you want to say Chris has high-functioning autism is certainly one thing, because it can be argued very much that Chris probably has a lot of underlying mental health issues aside from this. It could be bipolar disorder for all we know that Chris also might have. But without any concrete proof, this is the sort of thing that can only be speculated in regards to what we know of Chris's behaviour back then and possibly what goes on right now. Although a lot of people lean towards schizophrenia with that sort of thing. But let's keep going. When under the effects of stress, Chris typically posted videos without his glasses and talked in a more meek voice. It is during these periods that Chris will opt to remove himself from the internet for about a week or so, and then come back feeling refreshed, rejuvenated, and given a new resolve to finish the love quest. This is most likely due to his autistic regenerative abilities that make him sure that his heart never goes below 0% and into the negatives. Chris often cites stress as the reason why he isn't inspired to work on the comics. Precisely why inspiration is needed to make Sonic recolors have sex with each other and kill Chris's enemies is not apparent. In August 2013, Chris indicated through Facebook that his stress is beginning to take a toll on his health. Given his rather unhealthy lifestyle, it's not unlikely. Well, as I said before, ladies and gentlemen, Chris's past and through years of Big Macs and Coca-Cola, these things catch up with you, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can't escape from your past and you can't escape from what you actually are. So here we have, ladies and gentlemen, are the category for stressors, examples, and from his identity, his mental block of autism, talking to anyone about anything except himself, having his identity questioned, being referred to with the incorrect pronouns, his daily struggle against becoming homosexual pre-2014, being called naive, anything that autism isn't an excuse for. So, just very quickly, one at a time, his mental block of autism. In regards to how autism affects the brain, there's no real thing that autism actually blocks a person from doing. If there is one thing that maybe Chris is trying to get at, is the idea that he is possibly under the impression that maybe his mental block is the fact that his level of social interaction is not quite as inspired, or maybe quite like people he idolizes, without understanding exactly why. It could be through the lens of television, or it could be through the lens of certain scenarios in which people talk or act in a certain way. Which is something that Chris might simply not understand. Talking to anyone about anything except himself. It's no doubt probably Chris considers himself a very wise, noble scholar, but if he does, then he doesn't act like a very wise and noble scholar, because unless prompted, ladies and gentlemen, I won't really say anything about myself. So that's the sort of thing that Chris probably should have just taken cues of. And you know what? If Chris genuinely thought he was as special as he is making himself out to be, then why doesn't Chris just do something inspired or special or important? people are more impressed by that sort of thing than, just seeing somebody draw recolors of Sonic the Hedgehog characters. Having his identity questioned, well, the only thing I could suggest to this is that why Chris legitimately thought this was something he should have paid attention to, when this is something that he should have known for himself, as hard as it might have been. He should have fine well known that he could have been this ridiculous to believe this at face value. Being referred to with the incorrect pronouns. Now, with that being said, if Chris, I suppose, again, it probably was the sort of thing that maybe offended Chris, at the fact that nobody was believing that he wanted to be a trans woman. And I suppose, again, this is just the sort of thing that trolls and weens will do all the time just to get a rise out of Chris. And despite the fact that Chris constantly gets told not to interact with trolls or just block them without saying anything to them, Chris continues to prove us all wrong time and time again, because he just does it for the sake of it. His daily struggle against becoming homosexual pre-2014, however, Chris's ideas about homosexuality are all mended from the idea that people who are homosexual are going to take over the earth, something akin to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which Chris should have... I think Chris honestly should have just straight up known better than this. So there's no real excuse for that, to be honest. So no. Being called naive, despite the fact Chris heavily disregards this in many ways, he is naive. His experience of the world is somewhat limited. If he went further afield, if he actually spent, I don't know, maybe a couple of days in Cleveland, that would have been a little bit something out of his comfort zone. If he actually tried experiencing going from job to job and knowing the ins and outs of different industries, including the ones that Chris was exclusively wanting to be a part of, then he would be a little bit more ethereal. But the point is that Chris can't be anything except naive, because, well, he would rather stay at home in his room playing Guitar Hero. If he didn't want... Again, if you don't want to be called that word, ladies and gentlemen, then stop acting like that word. Is something that I could say for a lot of... with Chris's identity issues, with his stressors. Anything that autism isn't an excuse for. Well, to be honest, that's about as pathetic as it sounds, and why Chris legitimately can't just come to the conclusion that actually there are so many things that, he could give praise to. Have you ever noticed that it's usually whenever it comes to things that he has to use autism as an excuse for, that Chris will ever be spurred, pun not intended, to mention autism at all? Why doesn't he mention autism in many of the exciting things that he's done, or the really super unique things that he's done, or shows off as an example? Well, whatever those may be is an open point. So let's keep going. The Sonichu comic, being paranoid, copyright issues, his characters being accused of homosexuality, his characters being redesigned by a fan artist. Chris considers the idea of literally somebody mocking his work, when Chris would later go on and beforehand state that people need to understand. And by the way, if Chris labels his work as a parody, then why has he got an issue with somebody parodying his work? Copyright issues. Chris seems to... Well, again, because of the way that Chris went through his copyright, and the fact that he knew... Well, maybe he didn't know willingly when he filled out his copyright trademark from the University of the Virginia Court of Congress, or whatever it was. Basically, I did an entire video about that as well, and it's got its blaring issues. And I've said this before, even from somebody who understands quite a lot of things about the law with things like copyright, is that Chris should have just left Sonichu in the dust and actually done something actually original, which is something that his high school art teacher told him, but Chris chose not to listen. His characters being accused of homosexuality. This is because Chris considers his characters to be real, and, well, even though he is somewhat takes up as the role as father, he doesn't act like the sort of father that really is particularly accepting of those terms. And also his character's being redesigned by a fan artist. Chris just ungrateful for the fact that anybody, and I mean anybody, would take out their time to even entertain Chris with some works that they've done, is just, well, Chris being a dick to most people. And that's enough for him. And especially because in recent times with Project SNT, it's very difficult to justify why Chris isn't a little bit more grateful for the things he does. And I will get into a larger video about Chris's generosity and rather his, later on. Online presence, being infamous for the things Chris does, the existence of web pages outlining his many failures. Well, if Chris didn't want any of these for going out, he should have sought to correct his behavior a lot sooner, and people would just let him well alone. Criticism, constructive or otherwise, again, people in Chris's situation are not good at taking this because it means they have to accept that the things they did were bad. Having drawings of him finger-banging Megan confused with Crystal. Chris has nowhere to turn again to this one, ladies and gentlemen. He did this entirely by himself, so he hasn't got anyone else to blame except himself. Domestic life, chores, because Chris is just as much as a pack rat as he calls his own mother. Back when Bob was still alive, his willingness to call Chris out on his bullshit and his rare hand washing, but living in his super fun site is perfectly okay. Well, what can I say? If Chris, you know what? You make your bed, you lie in it. No wonder it burned to the ground. Outside the house, anything requiring him to leave the house, getting a job, being banned from places he frequents, being banned from conventions, trying to get unbanned from the game place, losing trading card matches, including 2 children, going to jail for fucking his own mother. Because, you know, that would be too much effort. That was entirely his fault. Also entirely his fault. Well, more motivated by the trolls, but yes, that was still Chris for believing it. Chris not learning to take it on the chin, especially when it comes to literally playing games with children, and because Chris thought that this was absolutely a good idea, and Chris was under the impression that even after years of saying this, he still thinks that was the thing to do. Sweethearts. Taking women and the associated infinitely high boyfriend factor, or the fact that, again, Chris's methods just did not work. Asking girls to go out with him because, being friend-zoned, his hormones. AKA, Chris seems more akin to his love quest, was basically just after somebody that he can have sex with and then, theoretically breed a daughter named Crystal. And so they're almost entirely motivated by what he wants as opposed to anything that any potential bachelorette could possibly want. Antagonists. Clyde Cash, the man in the pickle suit, bullies, trolls, the PVCC faculty, having someone pretend to be him, being confronted by his sweetheart's father, being called a child. Again, if Chris had any sense whatsoever, he would have learned to have ignored, followed their rules, ignored, be open and honest from the very beginning, and also, you know, use that as the sort of point to really consider just about exactly where you are in life. And, again, if Chris didn't want to be called this, then he would not be acting like one. Others. Pickles, mortality, doses of reality, Sega changing the colour of Sonic's arms to blue, anything slightly inconvenient, anything that stress isn't an excuse for. And we also have lists of how he handles stress by masturbating, having a sweetheart reset his biological clock, the prospect of having a sex time, playing video games, hiring prostitutes, taking medication, wishing he were in another dimension, and switching between souls of Magichan, Sonichu, or Mewtwo to escape conflicts. Universally used by most men in the universe, but again, if there comes a point in your life, ladies and gentlemen, where you are literally masturbating your stresses away at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday afternoon, When you think about that for 1 second and you realize that you've literally not got anything better to do at that time, that's probably when you should pull your pants back up and actually put your big boy pants on and actually do something instead, something more practical with both hands. Having a sweetheart reset his biological clock, Chris not knowing what he's talking about by thinking that a woman is just going to fix all of Chris's problems. The prospect of having a sex time, aka something that Chris wants, as opposed to, well, what anybody else could possibly want. Playing video games, which I've been like playing video games a little bit, like whenever I have like any spare moments, or when like like a video is like rendering, or I can't think of anything better to do. But it's just, well, once it's done, once like the novelty and the fun like wears off, ladies and gentlemen, you're gonna have to accept reality once again. Hiring prostitutes, technically illegal in the state of Virginia, so, and even then, this only really happened once anyway, as far as we know, so it was just the only thing Chris could do to unleash his carnal desires in a way that was okay, I suppose. Well, maybe for his perspective. Taking medication, possibly due to the alarming number of problems with Chris's health, it's no surprise. Wishing he were in another dimension, despite the fact that somebody claimed and called Chris out by saying that simply saying he was in another dimension will not change the way he interacts and is with other people, and that Chris should instead come back down to earth and handle his problems as an adult. Switching between Souls and Magi-chan, Sonaju, or Mewtwo to escape conflicts, and to shadow guise the fact that Chris's life couldn't be anywhere near what he thought it was ever going to be if this is his solution to his problems. Things that Chris does when stressed. Shits himself, cries, becomes more productive than usual, rages about his pitiful adult life in YouTube videos, rages at his mailers, sends death threats, abuses his camera, crashes into slumber, becomes incredibly homophobic, becomes increasingly racist, sighs excessively, suffers from memory loss, draws hideous hardcore pornography of his friends and personas, drinks, attempts vehicular homicide, considers the S word. Stress high. The stress high is Chris's unusual reaction to stress. Initially an unconscious coping mechanism, Chris has made habit of directing attention to it in an effort to gain sympathy. Chris has used it in conversation to discourage further unwanted scrutiny or to express disapproval at having his desires deferred. The places where Chris would sigh while speaking in person are noted in all of his written communications with sigh. Because for some reason Chris needs for the world to know that he's in this position, when you don't really need to. I think it's one of those it speaks for itself sort of things. The term stress high is presumed to originate from PVCC, due to the strong connection in Chris between sighing and stress. Chris refers to the stress sigh as only stress sigh. Did I say stress high? As only a sigh, suggesting to him that the link between sighing and stress is implicit. Chris makes a comparable noise, a short chirpy humph, to express contentment and self-satisfaction, usually of a smug variety. And speaking of smug, ladies and gentlemen, that was everything you needed to know about Chris and stress. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I must say, just before we go, is that people get stressed. Chris is not the first person in history to ever become stressed at a situation, and he is not going to be the last either. You may argue that the way Chris handles stress is not necessarily terribly well. In some cases, yes, they should be incredibly discouraged. But some of them are just sort of, well, what else do you expect him to do? And maybe that's the thing as well, is that trying to avoid, for me at least, trying to say that Chris would have been better off if he did as I say. I don't think that's particularly the right attitude to this. I think if there was any way in which Chris could, or for people watching that right now, if you are suffering from issues with regards to stress, one of the many things that, well, certainly I do, is just say, you know what, and again, always refer to this, ladies and gentlemen, as a great point of reference to decrease the intent of becoming stressed and so you can stay more focused on the things you need to pay attention to. And it is this: never ever ever walk away from an experience thinking, thank God it's over. Think about what you've actually learned through your experience. And once you've done that, it means that you can go to the next thing you've got to deal with, and you could be a bit more understanding of why it needs to be done. And you could also get around the fact that actually it's nowhere near as difficult as it sounds, and you could come away a much better and happier person, knowing that at the end of the day, you only did your very best to try and put yourself in a better situation. Nobody can really ask anything more from you from that. And there's no doubt probably people have said this towards Chris as well, because there probably must have been people back in the day who just wanted the best for Chris, but they were also probably under the impression that Chris had to be able to do them for himself. And one of the ways to do that is learn how to deal with your problems, or how to deal with the fact that life is not always fun and games. Life is sometimes work, life is sometimes play, life is sometimes happy, life is sometimes sad. It's how you learn to deal with them, and then you can process them in your own way and then move on. Chris was probably never shown how to do this, or Chris lacks the initiative to know that maybe if he tried doing this, things could be better for him in the long run. Now, with that being said, I'm not an expert on handling stress or being like a life coach in any way, but I have at least 26 years of experience being on this earth, ladies and gentlemen, and you begin to learn quite a number of things just by using your eyes. And from what I see, ladies and gentlemen, is that Chris just did not know how to deal with things, and he didn't exactly know how to orchestrate his thoughts into the situation he's in, and he became so accustomed to it, owing to his enabling parents, that literally having to do anything that resembled anything that any other adult would do in the real world was simply too much, and Chris resented it, because he resents work in the same way a dog will resent fleas. It will try and shake it off and try to have as little to do with it as possible. And with all that being said and done, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys have enjoyed this reading of Chris and Stress, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.